This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association of Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a research fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, IBEI, who specializes in the strategic culture, quote-unquote, and how it affects policymaking in the field of national security. We are here to discuss this issue in an Israeli context. Dr. Tamir Libel, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So tell us, what is strategic culture really, and how influential is it in determining the drafting of national security policies?
Strategic culture is a concept with some history already. It began at the early 70s when American strategists looked for a way to analyze the differences between the American and Soviet approaches to nuclear weapons. They begin to understand that the assumptions that both sides are completely rational may be a little not really well-grounded, let's say, and begin to look for ways to define what is a unique culture of each political entity and how to analyze it. In the literature, there were so far three generations that despite some progress in terms of how to define, how to measure, which sources to use, usually had two fallacies. They tend to assume that there is a continuity in terms of the content of the culture, and that there is also lack of change over time.
Right.
So they had a problem to explain sudden or surprising, in retrospect, policy changes.
Right.
To give a current example?
Please do. No, but I'm trying to say, how can you, I mean, maybe it's a methodological question, but really, how can you quantify and how can you define culture in a way that would assist you in studying it?
Thank you very much, too, for asking it. This is actually
my pleasure.
The panel that my colleague Tamir Libel and I organized. We look into the methodological innovations of the fourth generation of strategic culture. And I think that it will be very interesting because, first of all, you can, as far as I know, you cannot quantify culture. What you can do is look for a way to conceptualize strategic culture, or in other words, the culture, at least in how I use it in my paper, and I believe also my co-panelist, the culture of a specific group or a milieu that, and this is one of the innovations that we will present in the panel as part of the emerging fourth generation, competing subcultures. In other words, every polity, and this is something that existed in the generations before but was understudied, had several groups that compete to define the worldview, or like the Australian scholar Alan Bloomfield called it, the four-friend calculation.
The what, sorry?
The friend-enemy calculation.
Oh, the friend and foe calculation. Right, okay. I see. So let's go back to the beginning of it, to the 1970s and the US and Soviet scene. Can you give a particular example of, a certain aspect of strategic culture that determined policy at the end of the day?
I'm not sure if you mean, for example, of the study or example of influence of policy making.
On policy making.
I would say that indirectly these studies, as part of a more general terrain in international relations, help to emphasize that there are different styles of decision making. That what was before, or the assumptions that if we Americans believe that we are rational and we try to analyze Soviet decision making, then they will do the same assumptions that we are doing. For example, the assumption of mutual assured destruction.
Yeah.
We wouldn't hit them because if we hit them, they will hit us and it will be very bad. To use a more regional example, several years ago there were discussions what will happen if the Iranian regime would have a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments was that the Iranian wouldn't have so-called rational decision-making. A stronger influence of strategic culture would say, wait a second, are we completely irrational?
Yeah, but doesn't it really open the door to some kind of, a postmodern culturalist give and take about, trying to read the mind of the enemy, and something that would, at the end of the day, leave you at a dead end?
This is what happened in the third generation when you had a division between positivists, or let's say scholars who try to have a more social science approaches, which focused a lot about trying to define the unit of analysis and the relevant methodology, and more post-structuralist, interpretivist approaches.
Right.
What happens in the fourth generation is that you can say the positivist side try to make a progress, and much more emphasis is being put, which what I would present is a suggestion of an analytical framework, how to look on to connect the competing subcultures to another concept, a concept that already has a well-developed research design, which is epistemic communities.
How is that different from the cultural subgroups?
There is actually lack of definitions in the literature about what is subculture. The assumption is that it can take many forms. It can be different groups of politicians, it can be parties, it can be different, let's say, political organizations. If we think about Lebanon, for example, theoretically it can be Amal, which is a secular party, and Hezbollah, a more religious party.
Right.
My suggestion is to connect it to say that no matter what is subcultures, the basis of the concept is that every subcultures have a distinctive, a unique worldview. If you think about Israeli security, after the Second Lebanon War, you had a group of generals, especially retired generals, who say that we need to go back to basis.
Basis in what sense?
Of the basis of the IDF. To the good old tactics, to retrain like we trained in 73. And you had the group that was very influential before the war.
Because your specific paper here at the conference actually tackles what you call the paradigm shift in Israel's national security. Is what you're alluding to now just that?
Yeah.
So please take us through it. So let's start with what things were in the beginning and how it evolved until the turn of the very recent years.
Yeah. If I may just clarify two things.
Yes, please.
I'm not talking about the paradigm shift, but about the transformation of the Israeli security. My suggestion is that epistemic communities are defined as groups of experts and practitioners that share a worldview. In other words, it can be highly diversified groups. Each one of them is at the core of the subculture. And epistemic communities is a well-developed theory with a clear model that I adapted to my research. And I look into how competing epistemic communities within the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, competed over the hegemonic positions.
Okay, so what are very broadly the epistemic communities in Israel? Is one, as you said, going back to the basics of the army, and the other one being very cutting edge technologically? Is that what you would call epistemic community?
No, epistemic community exists in many fields. Basically, there is a crisis.
Yeah.
We had a crisis after the Second Lebanon War. How do we define Israeli security? Each group shares a worldview. What is the main threat? What is the best way to tackle it? And they try to gain influence over the decision-makings that if they adopt the worldview, this worldview will be institutionalized. There will be a new policy paper.
Right.
I identified three competing epistemic communities. The first one that I call the traditionalist is the epistemic communities that more or less shaped the Israel traditional security policies. The main threat is surprise attack or conventional war by regular Arab armed forces, and the IDF should train for conventional war. The second one began to emerge after the first Lebanon war at 82, when the IDF demonstrated serious deficiencies in command skills, and it based on trying to bring the IDF closer It was a professional model of Western armed forces. We had a doctrinal renaissance with publication and translations of some field manuals, establishment of the first professional military education program at PUMS, the Command and General Staff College, and this influence continued until the Second Intifada, when competing epistemic communities that was based at the Operational Theory Research Institute, the famous innovative IDF think tank, which began already in the mid-90s, gained influence.
Right.
Against, so basically...
So why isn't it paradigm shift? Because it's, one classic approach that is being gradually subsumed by another. Why wouldn't you call it paradigm shift?
Well, you remember what you said earlier, that strategic culture sounds a little fuzzy concept? Paradigm has as far as I understand it, has a very broad meaning, which can mean different things. How to measure, how to define, and there is a debate whether we actually have a paradigm in the social sciences. So what I can hope that if people who read my article would find convincing is that I suggest a way to show how a defined concept of strategic culture can be traced and analyzed, and how it leads to security policy changes operationalized through analysis of the competition between epistemic communities.
Okay, so when they're competing, what is really the middle ground they reach? Is it some sort of compromise between the worldviews, or is one really taking the upper hand at the expense of the other?
I show that there is a series of conflicts over the period between 1982 and 2014. Once there is a crisis, the epistemic communities that until then was hegemonic lose ground, and there is a new political space when decision makers look for a better approach to solve the crisis. This gives other epistemic communities the opportunity to organize and to suggest a worldview. But it's a competition, there is only one winner. The losing communities either become dormant and wait in the margins until there is a new crisis, but not every crisis, a crisis that is serious enough to initiate soul searching,
like war
or a low intensity conflict. But at any given moment there is only one dominant or hegemonic epistemic community. And I believe that these changes led in 2014 to the adoption of the first formal national military strategy.
The first ever?
Yeah, which is based on the campaign between the wars, המערכה בין המלחמות.
Meaning?
If until, let's say, the mid-90s at least, Israel was still focused on fighting conventional armed forces, the המערכה בין המלחמות, the campaign between the war concept says that at any given moment the IDF should operate mostly covertly across the entire spectrum of operations, means from covert action to use of the cyberspace or non-military means,
so basically,
in order to shape the playground in favor of Israel. If you think about the strikes according to foreign sources, the alleged strikes in Sudan, or some assassinations that happened in Syria, or perhaps some cyber attacks, this is to operate at any given moment in order to shape the operational environment in ways that is in favor of Israel. For example, to ensure that Hezbollah doesn't have advanced anti-air...
But is that new? I mean, Israel's long arm, be it Mossad or any other security agency, always worked behind the scenes and internationally to give Israel's national security the upper hand.
What is new, I would say, is that conventional war is formally downplayed in importance, and that organs that were already existed are regrouped. Several years ago, the IDF established the Pikud HaOmek, the first designated command center for operations that takes place on long distances. The integration between the interagency coordination with the Mossad and Shabak is much better than ever before. And what is really new is to have a concept that organized all of it. By the end, epistemic communities is not necessarily to invent new institutions. It's exactly the core that Alan Bloomfield, that I mentioned before, said, it's a friend-enemy calculation. It's to organize our worldview.
That's very interesting. But I'm afraid we have time for Dr. Tamir Libel, your research fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, IBEI, and a specialist of strategic culture and how it affects policymaking in the field of national security. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our trusted sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
ליד התחנה המרכזית, גשם על הכביש, ראיתי איש זקן יושב לבד ומחריש. לאן לפנות שאלתי, לשמאל או לימין? תלך ישר, כך הוא אמר, ישר ותאמין. אם לא תעשה לחברך מה שלעצמך